Good morning. Oh, we got everybody's on time this morning.
Birthday boy, hey, how are you doing?
Well, how are you? You're outside. Wow, that's smart.
I am.
Hi, Maggie. Hey, Lisa.
Good morning.
Hi.
Let's see here. I tried to.
Good morning.
Good morning, Lisa.
Good morning.
Yeah, I tried to change this so I didn't have to let people in, but apparently I still have to let
I
people.
don't do that since they've had a security problem, I was told.
Oh, is that right?
I think Bob Snyder told me that. They had a security problem, and that's why they let everyone in.
Yep, that's exactly right.
Oh, well, who's Bobby?
You need your Treasury Ellen to be assisting you.
Hey, Karen. Hey, Maggie. Look who's here. Bob.
Hey, Bobby.
How are you, Lisa?
Morning. Good.
Good.
So we got almost everybody here. Everybody's checking in promptly on time. This is great. I guess Jim's not here. I can't remember whether he said he was going to be here this week or not.
I know.
But anyway.
Is it warm outside? I haven't been out yet.
How is everybody?
We're great.
Good.
Thumbs up. Very good.
Yeah, it looks like it's going to be a great day, doesn't it? A good day to be outside.
Well, it's really
Yeah, it's supposed to warm up though. It's sort of late high 70s, maybe even 80. It'd be nice. What time is it? 9:02. We want to give Jim let's give Jim another minute. Yeah.
Maggie, are you leading the discussion Thursday?
Well, I don't know.
Yes. Yes.
Until further,
Now you know.
until further notice, right?
I checked with Molly. She said yes.
Then I'm happy to. I don't want to step on anyone's toes.
You won't. No, Molly was delighted. She was
Okay.
very happy. Yeah.
Then yes, Ellen, I am. So I better get reading
You better get working.
and watching. I better. What am I doing here?
I watched the video. I'm sure you'll be more animated. Hi, Karen Harris.
Karen
Ford.
Harris, where are you? Karen
Ford. Sorry.
Water.
Oh, hey, George.
Hi, how are we?
Oh, good.
Hey, George.
All right, if I'm a little distracted here, it's because I don't want to leave people out of this thing, and I've got this little window that tells me that people are waiting. But I don't know where Jim is. I can't. Something in my brain tells me that he said he might not be here this week, so I don't remember that for sure.
Yeah, I don't think Christine is going to sing this week, so I think they're gone.
Oh, is that right? Okay.
That's all rumor.
All right. Well, let's open with a little quick word of prayer, because again, I'll lose track and it'll cut me off at the end, so we probably won't be able to close with prayer. But so let's just pray for a second. Dear Lord, thank you for this opportunity to gather together virtually. Thank you for being with us through this trying time and protecting us and being with us in our times of anxiety and fear. Hopefully we can lead us through this till the end of this, which hopefully will be in the not too distant future. Thank you for this church family and all that we continue to try to do with the restrictions that we have. Thank you for this beautiful day and an opportunity to get out and enjoy your creation. I thank you mostly for your son, Jesus, in whose name we pray. Amen. So anybody have any opening thoughts about last week? We talked about, like George is here, so that's great. We talked about, we actually ended on the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin by the zealotrous sort of lone wolf assassin, apparently, who took it upon himself to punish Yitzhak Rabin for signing the Oslo peace accords and giving some of the land back trying, or at least laying the groundwork to give some of the land back to the Palestinians that was taken over in the '67 war. And that's kind of where we left off, because the next part of this book moves into fundamentalism in the United States, and but that's where we stopped. Any comments or thoughts about any of that? No. Well, what this author does, and again, I think last week Jim called me to task a little bit at the end, reminding me that that I should be reminding people that this author that we're reading, this Reza Aslan, is a Muslim. So you know, we have to, you know, we're seeing these issues through his eyes, which I think is valuable, but I think it also has to be in the back of our mind as we read this, is that we're hearing an opinion that's probably a lot different than ours, or at least it's framed in a lot different thought. But he starts talking about how the Jewish Zionists and this man that shot Yitzhak Rabin is a representative of that sort of radical group, has their advocates in the United States. And he starts off by talking about our esteemed neighbor up the road, Pat Robertson, who, and the quote in here, which was right after the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, which was in the mid-'90s, says when Pat Robertson, America's premier evangelical preacher, it was at the time, heard about the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, he was convinced it was part of God's master plan for the region. This is God's land, Robertson declared, and God has strong words about someone who parts and divides his land. The rabbi has put a curse on Yitzhak Rabin when he began cutting up the land. And then he goes on and talks about that there's a coalition of American evangelical organizations that very much support these Israelis who view this as a cosmic war. And again, for those of us that haven't been through this whole book so far, Aslan describes a cosmic war as a war where not between two religions so much as between one religion and everybody else. So one religious group that thinks they've got the truth and everybody else is in the wrong. So a very, very distinct, very black, white, very sort of rigid view of the world. He then goes on to call it this coalition of evangelical organizations to support these Jewish Zionists. So he calls them Christian Zionists. It was a term coined by a man named Theodore Herzl, who I'm not familiar with. But that sometimes these groups actually undermine the peace process in the Middle East by being so rigid in their opinions.
Can I chirp in?
Please do, George. I'm glad you're here, because it's
that was part of it from a Jewish perspective. I thought Theodore Herzl was one of the founding fathers of Zionism, and Judaism is, I best consider it's a civilization, because Jews have been all over the world. And in the Second World War, they discovered they weren't German or Polish or Russian or anything else. They were Jews and worthy of annihilation. But Judaism, just like Christianity, and I suspect like folks who are Muslim, have fringes on the right and the left. And the zealot who assassinated Rabin was one of those fringes, just like if you go to Brooklyn or areas in Baltimore and you see the ultra-religious Jews with their lovely hats and the younger men with their sideburns, they don't talk to regular Jews. If I went up and said shalom, they have want nothing to do with me. In terms of, funerals right now, they still gather in groups. There are many of them who believe that the Holocaust was God's way of getting even with all those Jews who have gone against God.
Wow.
And
Pretty harsh.
from my perspective of at least the first 5 books, God is loving, but he's also very vengeful, and he feels that we were, quote, chosen, and we're not supposed to assimilate. That's the easiest way, I mean, from my perspective, to look at it. So when Yitzhak Rabin or any other person in the Middle East wants to try to stabilize the situation, etc., or give stuff back to the Palestinians, there'll be those people who strongly feel that the Bible said that's where Israel's supposed to be, and everybody else really doesn't belong. And I realize there are a lot more Muslims around, but when I was looking at the notes that you had on the Crusades, where the Pope sent people to, I guess, free Jerusalem from the Muslims, wasn't really freeing Jerusalem to return it to the Jews. Because when the last crusade ended at roughly 1492, you're saying, and the Christians were able to kick the Muslims out of Spain and Portugal, they also kicked the Jews out of Spain and Portugal. That was the end of the Inquisition. From the Jews' perspective, you know, if you were Jewish, you had 3 options. You could convert, you could stay and hide, or you could leave. You didn't really care. So the fact that a zealot did that was unfortunate, but there are still conservative or ultra-conservative Jews in Israel who feel that they're supposed to close the airport on the Sabbath, on Saturday. You know, I mean, that's, you know, how can you do things? Well, there's a mix of people there, just like, again, Christianity has lots of different denominations, and they all have different names. So do Jews, but we're all just considered Jews. But there's a heck of a wide range of things. So I have to stop now. I know that.
Yeah.
I could go on for a long time.
No, I'm glad. I'm thrilled that you're here to share that perspective, because I'm certainly no expert on any of this stuff, really. So, but I think you hit on a very, very important point. And welcome to Jim and Carl, both popped in here, just so howdy. But one of the points you made very early on about there being fringes right and left in Judaism, as well as, you know, we're going to get into talking about it here in the United States and Christian evangelicals and such. But I think that's, again, this man being a Muslim, that's his point, is that you know, radicalism is not confined to Islam, and you know, these fringes that are in Islam, you know, unfortunately have been very violent and destructive and such. But as he goes through history, and points out that in the other monotheistic religions, there certainly are fringes as well. And I think that was the point of telling this story about Yitzhak Rabin, is that, you know, that there are fringes in every religion, and they can often result in violence. He talks about, you know, having a collective identity and then a collective call to action, and that collective call to action frequently turns to violence. That's kind of his thesis here. And so that's this particular guy, I unfortunately forget the man's name that shot Yitzhak Rabin, but you know, he was, you know, a part of this collective identity of very conservative Zionists that, you know, resented this attempt to return some of the lands to Palestine. Anyway, well, great. So we're talking about Pat Robertson a little bit, and his, you know, but that kind of sets the theme for what he talks about, what Aslan talks about in his book as, a lot of Americans seeing our country as the new Israel. And he goes back and talks about some of the founding fathers and how they were talking about Israel on the Potomac and all this sort of thing. And and a lot of the rhetoric with the war on terror is that, that America is a Christian country and we need to rid the world of these I guess, non-Christians. And which brings up the topic of where did these religious evangelicals and fundamentalists and he even uses the term fundamental evangelicals, which is really, if you want to start splitting hairs, I guess. But he starts talking about the history of this. He also talks about in the book about this idea of America as a new Israel, or America has this new covenant with God. That again, it falls in that paradigm of, well, if we're in the right and God is on our side, getting back to this cosmic war term that he's defined, then if America's in the right, then everybody else is in the wrong, and that's certainly. He goes through the last 120 years or so, and he quotes some of the propaganda from World War I, where the Germans weren't called Germans, they were called Huns. And they were, referring back almost to the Middle Ages. A lot of the propaganda the Huns were saints of unmitigated evil. So again, posing this war or this conflict as a religious or cosmic war. He quotes FDR in World War II. In a speech, he said, "The world is too small to provide adequate living room for both Hitler and for God." So he's again posing this as a religious war, and America being in the right, which and then he talks about Reagan in the '80s, which is the same time as the Star Wars movie. The first Star Wars movies were real popular, and he talks about the Soviet Union as the evil empire. So there's that jargon again, this good versus evil, God's on our side. This is a cosmic war, and even as recently as George W. Bush calling the terrorist groups and the axis of evil. I think I remember that term being thrown around quite a bit. He also talks about how these, I don't know, I don't want to offend anybody, but how you use some of these terms, these evangelicals or Christian. I don't want to say right wingers or conservatives, but you know who we're talking about. And he quotes Ted Haggard. This is on page 88 of the book. Said the Christian home is to be in a constant state of war. And then he quotes Jerry Falwell Sr., who, having lived in Lynchburg for the last 26 years, very familiar with him and his teachings. But he's quoted here as saying, "The local church is an organized army equipped for battle, ready to charge the enemy." And then I thought this was particularly interesting since this is a Sunday school class. But he said the Sunday school class is the attacking squad. The task of the Christian missionary is to bombard our territory, to move out near the coast and shell the enemy, to set loose on the enemy's stronghold. So here's this very military, violent rhetoric, sort of being usurped by these. I don't want to call them extremists, but who we're talking about, this religious coalition. So he talks about, Aslan says, so just as Israelis use religious symbols to bolster its military agenda, the religious right in America uses symbols of war and this rhetoric of military jargon to buoy its social agenda. And he concludes that little section by saying, contemporary evangelicalism seems to have so utterly absorbed the notion that warfare can be a valid expression of Christian faith, again, all the way back to the Crusades, that according to research done by preeminent scholar of American evangelicalism, George Marsden, evangelicals are far more likely than other Americans to sanction and support war. which is pretty amazing. So we're gonna talk about some of the history of where all these folks came from. But do we want any comments on the Falwell or this? And if you sit and listen to some of these folks, and I've watched some of these videos online, the verbiage is very military. It's very battle. So we have to go bombard our enemies, and again, it fits right into this cosmic war business that he's talked about since the very beginning of the book.
I figure if America had 50 million Jews with a variety of perspectives, I could see something different happening a couple of years ago in Charlottesville in terms of a response, because I'm not one of those who are going to replace them, but obviously them thinks that there are some of us who want to replace them. I just don't recall historically Jews going out on holy wars to convert people or to do something. I just sort of get a perspective they made some adjustments, migrated, got out of the way, and tried to say, just leave me alone. And after the Holocaust, the majority, I guess, came to, or before that, came to America. But I know that a lot of them went to South Africa. A lot of folks went to I think, Shanghai and China. Just the majority have come to the U.S. because it's a relative safe haven. But
right, and one of the points a few weeks back, was they were talking about how the Jews in Europe never really assimilated into the culture that they were living in. So a lot of the anti-Semitism that really started in the late 1800s and of course flourished in the 1900s, but came from this nationalism. Countries were sort of organizing this identity of who they were as a nation and as a culture, and then the Jews became the other because they didn't do that. They didn't assimilate into the culture, and they were easy targets, if you will.
And that's because Judaism can be, I'll agree, it's a civilization. I don't have to be a religious Jew. I can eat kosher, which I don't do, but there's a whole mess of different practices where you can learn to live a Jewish life. I had the idea, again, that prior to the Holocaust, if you asked a German Jew what he would say he was German. And a Polish Jew would say he was a Pole. And a Lithuanian Jew would say he was a Lithuanian. But Adolf Hitler managed to convince a much larger group that they really weren't that. They were different. If I chatted with you and just said, hey, I know we have a true Presbyterian and she's sitting outside. I remember we asked that question at church. What, did you grow up that? I've always been Jewish. I'm not sure how many folks are still, have always been Presbyterian. But if I asked you what you were, I figured you'd tell me you were either an Outer Bankser or you were an American. You wouldn't identify yourself religiously. Jews have gotten that way. I don't want to say Muslims have, but again, there's tons of Muslims, and if the right-wing zealots manage to get their hands on bombs and other things and decide to do something, it's what we have now, a terrible perspective on things.
Right. So he gets in the next chapter, after this one we're going to finish today, he actually gets back to Islam. And he taught, because whole book was written in response to 9/11, and so, but he talks about how the Sunnis and Shiites, who we talked about with the previous book, all of these jihadists are Sunnis, and they very much dislike the Shiites because they treat their imams like a prophet and all that sort of thing. But anyway, so we'll get into that next week. But I think what he's tried to do, what we've tried to do, what the author tried to do, is to show that radicalism is not confined to Islam, and that people can identify with these groups, and that collective identity can lead to violence, regardless of whether you're a Muslim, a Jew, or Christian, or whatever else you might be. But those are the three main monotheistic religions, and that's what he's talking about. So let's talk a little bit about the history of fundamentalism. Because again, I didn't know a whole lot about this, but it's pretty interesting stuff, and we could probably find a book or something and go into this in more detail if we wanted to. But it's apparently the whole fundamentalist movement started in the late 1800s. You remember in the last book we talked a little bit about the Enlightenment, which was really more the late 1700s, early 1800s, but where people started sort of doubting whether miracles as portrayed in the Bible actually happened. They started wondering about these things, and so instead of having religious explanations for natural phenomena, we now had scientific explanations. We had Newton and all these people coming along, scientists, and sort of the ultimate example of that, I think, is Thomas Jefferson, where he took the Bible and cut out everything that he thought was sort of preposterous, and was left with a very thin book, basically the Sermon on the Mount and a couple of some of the sermons, but threw out all the miracles and threw out all the divinity stuff, and so that's where we were in the early 1800s, and then along comes Darwin with sort of the ultimate scientific explanation for with evolution, and how that just really didn't mesh with the creation stories in the Bible. And so in the late 1800s, we sort of had a reaction to all this. People were saying, no, the Bible's right. This guy Darwin's full of hot air. And we started having these tent revival meetings, and a lot of it in the South and of the U.S. and in America. And there was I guess it was in 1919. There was a big meeting was held, and a group was formed called the World Christian Fundamental Organization, and it sort of organized these folks that were sort of reacting to what they called modernism, or this scientific explanations for natural phenomena rather than miracles or God's plan or whatever you want to try to explain it religiously. And there was a man named William Bell Riley who was sort of the kingpin of this organization, and made it go. And then there was another fellow named Curtis Laws, who was also very much involved in this fundamentalist movement. It took its name from that organization. They wanted to go back to Christian fundamentals, and it wasn't universally. It wasn't like everybody jumped on the bandwagon. There was a famous Henry Emerson Fosdick, who was a very famous Protestant preacher at the time. He gave a sermon where he claimed that the fundamentalist movement was anti-intellectual, anti-tradition, and anti-modern, and it sort of set the stage for conflict between these fundamentalists and maybe more, I hate to use progressive because that word has the connotation that it's better, but maybe more modern thinkers. And it all kind of came to a head. It didn't really come to a head, but the most famous clash of these groups was in 1925 with the Scopes monkey trial in Tennessee, which is really pretty fascinating. I knew a little bit about that, but I kind of read some more about it yesterday, and I want to learn more about it. It's really pretty amazing because it turns out it wasn't, it was all a setup. I mean, there was people that There's people on these fundamental sides that were funding this, and they picked this guy that was Scopes was the teacher that was supposedly taught evolution in the public school in Tennessee. Turns out he was actually the football coach and had only really substituted in like 1 or 2 classes and never really taught the evolution, but he was willing to be the name and be the person that they took this to trial. The 2 attorneys that were on either side were William Jennings Bryan, who had run for president 3 different times, was the prosecution, and Clarence Darrow, who was one thing I read compared to him, he said he was the Johnny Cochran of his time. He was the defense attorney that was famous for being a defense attorney. Who was the guy? Edward Bennett Williams, the guy that owned the Redskins. But, he was he wasn't a guy, a local yokel from Tennessee. He was somebody they brought in, and it was this huge staged trial to talk. Basically was whether evolution could be taught in the public schools. And that was in response to a bill that was published by what's the name of that guy? The guy named John W. Butler, who was a congressman, a state congressman in Tennessee, and he had put through a bill that was passed in the Tennessee legislature called the Butler Act that said it was illegal to teach evolution in public schools. So this whole trial was like an ACLU trial balloon attempt to contest this Butler Act. It was made famous. There was a book. It was actually a play. It started out called "Inherit the Wind," that was written about this, and it was subsequently made into a movie, which had all. I mean, you look at the people in this movie. I'm blocking all our names, but all the famous actors that were in this particular movie. I just happened. I noticed when I was watching it, the judge in the trial was actually a very young actor, and it was the guy that was eventually Colonel Potter in MASH. The guy on TV. Anyway, the movie was released in 1955, and if you remember what was going on in 1955, it was McCarthyism. And this movie didn't really give a much care about evolution versus or fundamentalism versus modernism. It was all about free speech, and it was all the movie is all couched in 1950s politics, which is really pretty interesting to me. But anyway, so that's where. So then that's where it stood for a number of years in the Second World War. After the Second World War, we had people like Billy Graham come along. Billy Graham, they talked about a kinder, gentler form of fundamentalism, a more inclusive form of fundamentalism, if you will. And they became a little less dogmatic, I guess. And so that led to some division amongst the evangelicals. And Billy Graham, as you recall, also was involved with the civil rights movement in the 60s. So, here's an evangelical, and then he's making public appearances with Martin Luther King, and so it led to some dissension in the ranks in these fundamentalists. And so that's where we really get to sort of where we are today, with evangelicals, fundamentalists, and then what Aslan calls, and I guess is recognized as fundamental evangelicals. And basically, you have these socially and theologically maybe more lax. They're not as rigid or dogmatic. And you have people like Jim Wallace of Sojourners, who's a really wonderful guy. He's actually I think he's in the D.C. area, isn't he, Karen? I've read a couple of his books. He's amazing, in terms of feeding the hungry and all that. So, I mean, he's like right out there. And then you had the other more ideologically intransigent group, if you will, sort of represented more by people like Pat Robertson, James Dobson, and the Falwells, and now the Liberty Universities of the world. So you have basically now you have these evangelicals, and then you have these very, very fundamental evangelicals. But there's, according to Aslan, there's there's characteristics of these. We've got about 6 or 8 minutes left, so I'm gonna kind of rush through this so we actually have some time to talk about it. But the four characteristics of these evangelicals are: number one, their belief in the total literalism and inerrancy of the Bible, and the second is they have an emphasis on an unmediated relationship with Jesus Christ. We'll talk about that in just a second. But then the third thing is a zealous devotion to conversion of others, which is where they run into problems with Muslims, because Muslims, in Muslim countries, you're not even allowed to proselytize or try to convert. And then this cosmic worldview that the universe is divided in two: the moral and the immoral, the forces of light and the forces of darkness. Again, it kind of gets all the way back to Star Wars. You have Darth Vader in black and the Rebel Alliance in white. So he says that the combination of those four things, when rigidly adopted and as a whole, results in a kind of a spiritual rebirth that segregates evangelicals from all other Christians. Salvation comes only to those who are born again. And we had Jody, I think, talked a couple of weeks ago about that from John, about the term born again. And I think that means different things to different people. But Aslan goes on page 93. He says, there exists in this movement, this evangelical movement, a socially constructed atmosphere of crisis, conflict, and threat derived from the perception that as those who have been born again, evangelicals have inherited God's covenant from Israel, and that they are the new chosen people. And like the Israelites of old, they must forever be detested by God and despised by the world. So it's a very much of an us versus them mentality, this cosmic war view. And then it begets a fervent religious nationalism. We've danced around this whole identity issue, like you talked about, George, with how you identify yourself as an American or as a Presbyterian or as a Orthodox Jew or whatever, however you identify yourself. But this fervent religious nationalism, this conviction that these people have that the United States is a Christian nation, appointed by God to establish Christian values throughout the rest of the world. The United States has been elevated to a sacred status, and therefore America's enemies are God's enemies. And he goes through again talking about George Bush calling Osama bin Laden the evil one, and that kind of stuff. And I'm going to finish this the way he finishes the chapter, and then we'll let everybody else chime in here. But he says, Osama bin Laden, where's the end of this? Basically, he said, well, let me just summarize it. He says, he wrote a letter while the Americans were in Iraq and things were hot and heavy in Iraq. This is Osama bin Laden, to my brother, holy warriors in Iraq, holy warriors, cosmic war. To the heroes of Baghdad, the house of the caliphate. Again, the Muslims have no caliphate, haven't had a caliphate since 1924. They need a central leader. And all around the descendants of Saladin. Saladin was the sultan that took back in the middle of took back Jerusalem during the Crusades. To the free men of all these Iraqi cities. So those who have emigrated for the sake of God to fight for the victory of their religion, leaving their fathers and sons, leaving their family and homeland. The Romans have gathered under the banner of the cross to fight the nation of beloved Muhammad. Lord, give us patience, make us stand firm, and help us struggle against the infidels. God will be victorious. That was Osama bin Laden in 2003 or so, 4. So there you have it. This fundamental. Does anybody believe all that? That these fundamentalists really have this vision as the new Israel, and we're in the right, everybody's in the wrong, or has he overstated the situation?
Well, based on my limited experience with living in the Shenandoah Valley and there being a plethora of these individuals, I believe that there is some truth to that. Of course, it's on a continuum of fervency in their belief, but my kids were regularly told they were going to hell because they didn't go to one of the approved social churches in